Hey guys, welcome to today's lesson on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So before we get started, I do want to just draw your attention to the handout that you guys should have in front of you. It looks like this. You should have this open along with the video notes that you will find in Google Classroom. If you don't have this open, make sure to go to Google Classroom and open this up because this is where you're going to be recording the notes that we do here in just a second. So make sure you get that up. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about today is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So far this unit, we've looked at the difference between a hot war and a cold war. A hot war being a war with active fighting, and a cold war being really a war of ideology. It's strategic. You're trying to outwit, outmatch your rival, I should say. The Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the times during the Cold War that we are on the brink of a hot war. So here, our learning targets today are to explain how the rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union led to this conflict in Cuba. We're going to hypothesize why certain aspects of this Cuban Missile Crisis were kept secret from the general public. And we're going to explain the consequences of the nuclear arms races that we've looked at so far this unit as well. So just some context, in the 1960s, we're really going to see this Cold War come to a peak. This is going to be peak tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. So we've talked about how the the Cold War starts really at the end of World War II. It's going to come to a peak in the 1960s, and then after this, we're going to see it slowly taper off, and then by 1991 be completely over. In the 1960s, as we've talked about, the nuclear arms race was underway. Each country is trying to outdo the other with the number and size of their nuclear weapons. So in the last lesson, you should have completed the activity where you were testing the bombs made during the Cold War. So you can see how these countries were trying to outdo one another. And this is really kind of a plan or a policy of brinkmanship. You go to the edge of war or the brink of war, and you're trying to intimidate your enemy and make them back down. This leads to a lot of fear and anxiety during this time, which is what the Cuban Missile Crisis is ultimately going to be about. And then, as I just said, the Cuban Missile Crisis is an example of this brinkmanship. Okay, so some more context on the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have to talk about Cuba, which is where this entire event plays out. So in 1959, Cuba is going to become a communist country led by a man named Fidel Castro. And something very important to know about this is Cuba is only 90 miles from the United States, so it's in very, very close proximity to our country. Our president during the Cuban Missile Crisis is John F. Kennedy. So JFK is going to be a name that you hear or see quite a bit in the activity that we do after these notes. And then also another player in this crisis is going to be Nikita Khrushchev, and he is the leader of the USSR. He's one of many, many leaders that control the Soviet Union after Stalin's death. So just giving you guys an idea, down here, this red island is Cuba. So you can see that it is very, very close to the United States, in particular Florida, and a lot of these other coastal states. So the Cuban Missile Crisis itself lasts from October 14th to October 28th, 1962. And this is a confrontation that we see between the United States and the Soviet Union that plays out in communist Cuba. So we've talked about how these are proxy wars or proxy conflicts, right? The US and Soviet Union are not fighting directly, but it's a tense battle, so to speak, of ideology, of, as we will see, potential war that is going to play out in another country. And in this particular instance, in Cuba, which is communist and therefore supported by the Soviet Union. Now, our CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, is going to learn that the Soviets have placed long-range missiles in Cuba, and these are a type of nuclear weapon. And this is obviously a serious threat to US security. I actually have a map that I'll pull up in just a second that's showing you guys the range of these missiles, but this posed some serious concerns to JFK and his administration, because the Soviets could strike the US with only a few minutes warning. These missiles at the time were state of the art, and they would have done significant damage and led to a significant loss of life. So this was definitely something that JFK faced as a pretty big national security concern. As I said, this is the range of the Soviet missiles if they had been launched from Cuba. So these here, this is Cuba, this is where they were placed. You have your medium range ballistic missiles, so these are a little bit smaller. As you can see, it would have reached all the way into Mexico here, like central Mexico. And then if they had launched their long range ballistic missiles, you can see that it would have gone almost to the Pacific Northwest up here in like Washington. So they had some significant distance on them that would have done a lot of damage. Now, there is some key information that we have to talk about that was left out of the American newspapers, right? What the Americans or the American public is getting at this time is that the Soviets have missiles in Cuba. The Soviets are the bad guys, right? We've talked about this. Propaganda was huge during this time, wanting to make the Soviet Union look like the bad guys. But there was some key information left out that Americans didn't know, and that was that we had similar missiles in Turkey, which is right here, pointed at the USSR. Okay, so just like the Soviets had missiles in Cuba, we also had missiles in Turkey pointed at our enemy, which you can see would have reached into kind of the heart of the Soviet Union here. And also, what the Americans don't find out is part of the agreement to remove the missiles in Cuba was to also remove ours from Turkey. So this is really what ends the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets do end up withdrawing their missiles from Cuba on the contingency that we also remove our missiles from Turkey. So as you go through the simulation, and then towards the end of this activity, I want you to think about, why do you think this information was not shared with the American public? Why did JFK and his administration not want the people to know that we also had missiles in Turkey? Think about, what advantage did that give maybe the US? What maybe was JFK fearful of? So just think about those things as you are moving through the simulation. Okay, so moving into the activity, you are going to go to this site, which is a simulation on the Cuban Missile Crisis. You are going to act as all three leaders during this time. So you're going to play the simulation 3 times through. It's not long, but you will play as Castro of Cuba, Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, and JFK as the United States. And as you go, you will answer the questions that are on your handout below where the notes were. Please make sure you're reading directions, okay? There are some key things that you might miss if you're not reading the situations and the directions, so please make sure you're doing that. And then once you're finished with the simulation, playing it through 3 times through, you will answer the summary questions that are on the bottom and then submit this to Google Classroom. If you guys have any questions, please reach out during office hours every day, Monday through Friday, from 9 to 11 and then 1 to 2, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.